The bullet that killed Olivia Edwards' husband hadn't been meant for him. But that detail hardly mattered when she stood at his graveside in the scorching Montana summer of 1878, watching the preacher's mouth move without hearing a single word he said. She had been 23 years old when she married Thomas Edwards, a banker's son with soft hands and softer promises, and 24 when she buried him 6 months later in the hard dirt outside Benton, Montana. The robbery had been quick and brutal. Thomas caught in the crossfire when 3 masked men burst through the bank doors on a Tuesday afternoon. He had tried to be brave, tried to shield her from the violence, and it had cost him everything. Now, 3 months after laying him to rest, Olivia stood behind the counter of the general store she had taken over from old Mrs. Patterson, measuring flour and counting coins with hands that no longer trembled. Her black mourning dress had faded to gray from washing, and she told herself she didn't mind. Color felt like a betrayal anyway. The bell above the door chimed, and she looked up to see a tall man in dusty trail clothes, his hat pulled low enough that shadows obscured most of his face. He moved with the careful deliberation of someone used to watching his surroundings, and Olivia's hand instinctively moved toward the rifle she kept beneath the counter. "Morning, madam," he said, his voice low and respectful as he removed his hat. Dark hair fell across his forehead, and when he met her eyes, she saw they were the color of strong coffee. "I'm looking for work. Heard in town you might need someone to help with heavy lifting and deliveries." Olivia's jaw tightened. She did need help. The store required moving crates and barrels that strained her back, and several customers had asked about delivery service. But hiring someone meant trusting someone, and trust was a luxury she could no longer afford. "I manage fine on my own," she said, her voice clipped. The man didn't move toward the door. Instead, he glanced around the store, his gaze landing on a stack of flour sacks near the back that she hadn't been able to lift onto the proper shelves. "Those have been sitting there a while," he observed. "Flour doesn't sell well when folks can't reach it easy." Heat rushed to her cheeks. "I'll get to it." "I'm sure you will." He turned his hat in his hands, studying her with an expression that wasn't quite pity but something softer. "Name's Isaac Zimmerman. I'm not asking for much. Just honest work for honest pay. I can start today, and if you don't like my work by sundown, you don't owe me a cent." Something in his directness caught her off guard. Most men in Benton either treated her like fragile glass or looked at her like a problem to be solved, a young widow who needed a new husband. This man did neither. "Fine," she heard herself say, "but just for today, and you'll take your payment and leave." Isaac's mouth curved slightly. Not quite a smile, but close. "Yes, madam." He moved those flour sacks within the hour, reorganized the back storeroom, and repaired a loose board on the front steps she'd been meaning to fix for weeks. He worked steadily and without complaint, speaking only to ask where things should go or how she wanted something arranged. When customers came in, he made himself scarce, understanding without being told that she needed to maintain control of her own business. By the time the sun began its descent toward the mountains, Olivia found herself watching him more than she should. There was something solid about Isaac Zimmerman, something that suggested he'd weathered his own storms and come through them still standing. "You did good work," she admitted as she counted out his pay. "If you want to come back tomorrow, I could use help with a shipment coming in." Isaac took the coins, his fingers careful not to brush hers. "I'll be here at dawn." He kept his word. Dawn the next morning found him on her doorstep, and the morning after that, and the morning after that. Days turned into weeks, and slowly, the store began to transform. Shelves were straightened, inventory was organized, and Isaac built a proper counter for the back room where deliveries could be sorted. He never pushed, never asked personal questions, never gave her reason to doubt his presence. But Olivia noticed things about him anyway. The way he always positioned himself between her and the door when strangers entered. The careful distance he maintained, as though he understood exactly how much space she needed. The quiet competence with which he handled every task, from the mundane to the challenging. "You've done this kind of work before," she said one afternoon as they unpacked a shipment of tinned goods. It wasn't quite a question. Isaac's hands paused briefly before continuing their steady work. "I've done a lot of things. Worked ranches, driven cattle, spent time mining in Colorado." A man learns to be useful. Why Benton, heard it was growing, seemed like a place a man could make a fresh start. He glanced at her. "Why did you stay after your husband died? Couldn't have been easy." The question should have felt intrusive, but his tone was genuinely curious, not probing. Olivia set down the tin she'd been holding. "I didn't have anywhere else to go. My family back in St. Louis didn't approve of Thomas. His family blamed me for his death, said if he hadn't been trying to protect me, he might have survived." The old anger stirred in her chest. "So I stayed because this store was the only thing that was truly mine." Isaac nodded slowly. "That takes strength, or stubbornness. Same thing sometimes." She found herself almost smiling, and the feeling was so foreign it startled her. Smiling felt like forgetting, and she wasn't ready to forget. Thomas deserved better than to be pushed aside for something as simple as a moment of levity. But Isaac didn't seem to expect anything from her. He simply returned to unpacking, and the moment passed without awkwardness. September brought cooler air and the first hints of autumn color to the cottonwoods along the creek. The store's business had picked up considerably, in part because Isaac had started making deliveries to the ranches and homesteads scattered around Benton. He had a way with people, Olivia noticed. He listened more than he spoke, and when he did speak, people seemed to trust him. She trusted him too, though she tried not to examine that feeling too closely. One evening, as they were closing up, a group of cowboys rode into town, their voices loud with whiskey and bravado. Olivia locked the door quickly, but one of them had already noticed the light in the window. "Hey, pretty lady," he called, dismounting with the exaggerated care of someone not quite steady on their feet. "How about some company? A widow shouldn't be alone." Fear spiked through her, sharp and immediate. She reached for the rifle, but Isaac was already moving. He stepped outside, positioning himself on the porch between Olivia and the cowboy. "Store's closed," Isaac said, his voice calm but carrying a weight that made the cowboy pause. "Best move along." "Who are you, her guard dog?" The cowboy's friends laughed, but there was uncertainty in the sound. "I'm someone telling you the store is closed." Isaac hadn't raised his voice, but something in his stance had changed. He looked taller, more dangerous. "You boys have a good night now." The cowboy stared at Isaac for a long moment, some calculation happening behind his whiskey-fogged eyes. Finally, he spat in the dirt and remounted his horse. "Wasn't worth it anyway," he muttered, and they rode off, their laughter forced and hollow. Isaac remained on the porch until they were out of sight. When he came back inside, Olivia was gripping the rifle so hard her knuckles were white. "You can put that down," he said gently. "They're gone. You didn't have to do that." Her voice shook despite her best efforts. "They could have hurt you." "They weren't going to hurt anyone. They were drunk and stupid, but they weren't looking for real trouble." Isaac took the rifle from her carefully and set it aside. "You're safe, Olivia." It was the first time he'd used her given name, and the intimacy of it broke something loose inside her. Tears spilled over before she could stop them, hot and furious and terrifying. She hadn't cried since the funeral, had locked everything down so tight she sometimes wondered if she'd ever feel anything again. "I'm sorry," she gasped, mortified. "I don't know why it's all right." Isaac's hand hovered near her shoulder but didn't touch. "You don't have to apologize." "Not to me." The tears came harder, and then she was sobbing, all the fear and grief and exhaustion pouring out in great, wrenching waves. Through it all, Isaac stood there, steady as a mountain, offering his presence without demanding anything in return. When the storm finally passed, Olivia felt hollowed out but oddly lighter. She wiped her eyes with her apron, embarrassed but not quite sorry. "Thank you," she whispered, "for being here, for not leaving." "I'm not going anywhere," Isaac said, and she believed him. October arrived with frost on the windows and wood smoke scenting the air. Isaac had been working at the store for nearly 3 months now, and Olivia had stopped pretending it was temporary. She paid him a fair wage, and he'd found a room at the boarding house on Main Street, settling into Benton like he'd always belonged there. They developed a rhythm, she and Isaac. He arrived at dawn, helped her open the store, handled the heavy work and deliveries while she managed the counter and the books. They ate lunch together in the back room, sharing bread and cheese and quiet conversation. He told her about his time in Colorado, about the mines and the men he'd worked with. She told him about growing up in St. Louis, about her mother's flower garden and her father's bookshop. She didn't talk about Thomas much, but when she did, Isaac listened without judgment or platitudes. He never told her it was time to move on or that she should be grateful for the time they'd had. He simply listened, and that made all the difference. "You ever think about settling down?" she asked one afternoon as they sorted through a shipment of fabric. "Getting your own place, starting a ranch?" Isaac considered the question. "I think about it sometimes, but ranching requires capital I don't have, and I'm not sure I'm cut out for that kind of life anymore." "What kind of life are you cut out for?" He looked at her, and something in his expression made her breath catch. "I'm still figuring that out." The moment stretched between them, loaded with meanings Olivia wasn't ready to examine. She looked away first, focusing intently on a bolt of blue calico that didn't need her attention. A week later, a well-dressed man arrived on the afternoon stage. He introduced himself as Charles Morrison, a business associate of Thomas's father, and asked to speak with Olivia privately. Isaac made himself scarce, but she could feel him hovering just outside, protective even in his absence. "Mrs. Edwards," Morrison began, settling into the chair across from her desk. "I'll be direct. Your late husband's family has sent me to make you an offer. They're willing to purchase this store from you at a very generous price, enough for you to return to St. Louis and live comfortably." Olivia's spine stiffened. "This store isn't for sale. I understand your attachment, but consider practically. A young woman alone in a frontier town, running a business without a husband's protection. It's not proper and it's not safe. I manage just fine." Morrison's smile was patronizing. "I'm sure you believe that. But the Edwards family feels responsible for you. Thomas would have wanted you cared for." Anger flared hot and bright in her chest. "Thomas would have wanted me to be happy. This store makes me happy. Please tell his family thank you for their concern, but my answer is no. Mrs. Edwards, I urge you to reconsider." She said no. Isaac's voice came from the doorway. He'd come back inside, and his expression was harder than she'd ever seen it. "I believe your business here is concluded." Morrison stood, his face flushing. "This is a private matter. And she's given you her answer. Time for you to leave." For a moment, Olivia thought Morrison might push the issue, but something in Isaac's stance discouraged argument. The businessman gathered his hat and case with stiff dignity. "I'll inform the family of your decision," he said coldly. "They won't be pleased." "They'll survive their disappointment," Olivia replied. After Morrison left, she let out a shaky breath. Isaac moved closer, concern replacing the hardness in his eyes. "You all right?" "I'm fine, just angry." She stood, needing to move to pace. They think I'm helpless. They think I need to be rescued and managed like some child. You're one of the strongest people I've ever met, Isaac said quietly. Anyone who can't see that is a fool. She stopped, turning to face him. You really believe that? I've believed it since the day I met you. He took a step closer, and her heart began to race. Olivia, I know you've got no reason to trust men's words, not after everything you've been through. But I need you to know that working here, being near you, it's become the best part of my life. I'm not asking for anything. I just wanted you to know. The honesty in his voice undid her. She'd spent months building walls around her heart, convincing herself she'd never risk caring again. But Isaac had been patient, had waited without pushing, had shown her through 1,000 small actions that not all men were careless with the things entrusted to them. I'm afraid, she whispered. I'm afraid of feeling this way again. What if something happens to you? What if I lose you like I lost Thomas? Isaac closed the distance between them, his hands gentle as they took hers. I can't promise nothing bad will ever happen. Life doesn't work that way. But I can promise I'll do everything in my power to come home to you every night. I can promise I'll never take your trust for granted. And I can promise that whatever time we have, I'll spend it trying to make you happy. Tears blurred her vision, but these were different from the ones she'd shed before. These felt like healing. I don't know if I remember how to do this. How to care for someone again. We'll figure it out together, Isaac said. No rush. We'll take it as slow as you need. She looked up at him, really looked at him, seeing clearly for the first time the depth of feeling in his eyes. He loved her. This quiet, patient man loved her, and he'd been content to wait until she was ready to see it. I think I'd like to try, she said softly. I think I'd like to figure it out together. The smile that spread across Isaac's face was like sunrise, warm and transforming. He raised her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles that felt like a promise. Then, we'll start right now. November brought the first real snow, and with it, a shift in how the town viewed Olivia and Isaac. People began referring to them as a pair, and while some tongues wagged about propriety and mourning periods, most folks seemed pleased that Olivia had found happiness again. Isaac still kept his room at the boarding house, maintaining the appearance of respectability, but they spent their evenings together now. Sometimes they'd sit in the back room of the store, talking and laughing while the snow fell outside. Other times they'd walk through town bundled in coats and scarves, their breath misting in the cold air. He courted her properly, bringing her small gifts, a ribbon for her hair, a book of poetry, wildflowers preserved between pages. He took her to church socials and town meetings, standing beside her with quiet pride. And slowly, carefully, he showed her that loving again didn't mean forgetting what came before. Tell me about Thomas, he said one evening as they sat by the stove. Really tell me. Not the sad parts, but who he was. Olivia was surprised by the request. Most people avoided mentioning Thomas as though speaking his name might shatter her, but Isaac looked genuinely interested, so she thought about it. He was kind, she said finally. Sometimes too kind. He'd give away money we couldn't afford to lose because someone had a sad story. He loved music but couldn't carry a tune to save his life. And he had this laugh, this really ridiculous laugh that made everyone around him laugh too. She smiled at the memory. He wasn't perfect. He was impulsive and terrible with details, but he was good and he loved me the best way he knew how. Isaac nodded thoughtfully. He sounds like someone worth remembering. He is. She reached for Isaac's hand, lacing their fingers together. Thank you for not being jealous of him. For understanding he'll always be part of my story. Your past made you who you are, Isaac said simply. I wouldn't want to erase any of it, even the painful parts. They led you here to this moment to us. The tenderness in his words wrapped around her heart like a warm blanket. This was different from what she'd had with Thomas. Thomas had loved her with youthful enthusiasm, all grand gestures and passionate declarations. Isaac loved her with the patience of someone who understood that the deepest feelings were often the quietest ones. Both were real. Both mattered. "I love you," she said, and watched his eyes widen. "I think I have for a while now. I was just too scared to admit it." Isaac pulled her closer, his forehead resting against hers. "I love you too, more than I thought possible. You've given me something I didn't even know I was looking for." "What's that, home?" He kissed her then, soft and sweet and full of promise. Olivia felt something inside her finally settle, the restless fear that had plagued her since Thomas's death easing into quiet certainty. This was right. Isaac was right. And maybe, just maybe, she could be brave enough to trust in that. Christmas arrived with deep snow and bright stars, and Benton transformed into something almost magical. The general store did brisk business, and Olivia found herself humming carols as she worked, something she hadn't done since she was a girl on Christmas Eve. Isaac took her to the church social, where the whole town gathered for singing and cider. Mrs. Patterson, who'd sold Olivia the store, pulled her aside with twinkling eyes. "That young man of yours is a keeper," she said. "I've seen the way he looks at you, like you hung the moon just for him." Olivia blushed but couldn't help smiling. "He's special." "So are you, dear." "I'm glad you both found each other." Later, as they walked back through the snow-hushed streets, Isaac stopped in front of the store. The windows glowed with lamplight and icicles hung from the eaves like crystal decorations. "I have something for you," he said, reaching into his coat pocket. "I wanted to wait for the right moment." He pulled out a small wooden box, carved with surprising delicacy. Inside, nestled on a piece of velvet, was a simple gold ring set with a small sapphire. Olivia's breath caught. "I'm not trying to rush you," Isaac said quickly. "And I know you might not be ready yet. But I wanted you to know my intentions are serious. When you're ready, if you're ready, I'd be honored to be your husband. To build a life with you. To wake up every morning and fall asleep every night knowing you're beside me." He paused, vulnerability clear in his face. "Will you marry me, Olivia? Not now, not until you're ready, but someday." Her heart felt too big for her chest. This man, this patient, wonderful man, was offering her forever while still giving her the space to come to it in her own time. "Yes," she whispered, then louder. "Yes, Isaac, I'll marry you." The joy that lit his face was worth everything. He slipped the ring on her finger and it fit perfectly, as though it had been waiting for her all along. Then he pulled her close and kissed her under the starlight, and Olivia felt something she'd thought lost forever. Hope for the future. They were married in March, when the snow began to melt and the first crocuses pushed through the earth. It was a small ceremony, held in the same church where Olivia had buried Thomas less than a year before. The full year of mourning wasn't quite complete, but the preacher was understanding, and the town was supportive. Olivia wore a simple blue dress that matched her ring, and Isaac stood at the altar looking nervous and proud in equal measure. As she walked toward him, she felt Thomas's memory like a gentle presence, not holding her back but wishing her forward. She would always love the boy who'd tried to protect her, but she was ready now to love the man who'd shown her how to trust again. "I, Isaac Zimmerman, take you, Olivia Edwards, to be my lawfully wedded wife," Isaac said, his voice steady and sure. "I promise to love you, to honor you, to stand beside you through whatever comes. I promise to be patient when you need patience, strong when you need strength, and gentle when you need gentleness. I promise to make you laugh, to hold you when you cry, and to remind you every day how extraordinary you are." By the time he finished, Olivia was crying, but these were happy tears. When it was her turn, She took a deep breath and met his eyes. "I, Olivia Edwards, take you, Isaac Zimmerman, to be my lawfully wedded husband. I promise to trust you with my heart, even though I know how fragile hearts can be. I promise to love you fiercely and honestly. I promise to build a life with you, not because I need rescuing, but because I choose you. Every day, for the rest of my days, I choose you." When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Isaac kissed her like she was something precious and rare, and the small congregation erupted in applause. The reception was held at the hotel, and it seemed like all of Benton turned out to celebrate. There was music and dancing and more food than seemed possible. Old Mrs. Patterson cried happy tears. The sheriff, a gruff man named Tom who'd investigated Thomas's death, shook Isaac's hand and told him he'd better take good care of their Olivia. Even Charles Morrison's warnings from the Edwards family felt distant and unimportant. As night fell and the celebration continued, Isaac pulled Olivia outside onto the hotel's porch. The air was cool but not cold, carrying the promise of spring. "Happy, Mrs. Zimmerman?" he asked, wrapping his arms around her waist. She leaned back against him, feeling the solid warmth of him, the steady beat of his heart. "Happier than I thought possible. You've given me something amazing, Isaac." "What's that?" "A second chance. Not just at love, but at believing good things can happen, at trusting life again." He turned her in his arms, his hands framing her face. "You gave me those things too. Before you, I was just drifting, looking for something I couldn't name. You gave me purpose. You gave me home." They kissed under the emerging stars. Two people who'd found their way to each other through patience and pain, and the slow, steady building of trust. Isaac had found a house for them on the edge of town, a small but sturdy place with good bones and a view of the mountains. They'd spent the weeks before the wedding fixing it up, painting walls and repairing shutters, turning it into something that belonged to both of them. Their first night there, as husband and wife, felt both momentous and perfectly natural. Isaac carried her over the threshold, making her laugh, and then set her down gently in the parlor. "I built something for you," he said, leading her to what had been an empty corner. Now it held a beautiful wooden shelf, and on it sat two photographs. One was of Thomas, young and smiling in his wedding suit. The other was of Isaac, taken just last week in town. Olivia's throat tightened with emotion. "Isaac, you loved him," Isaac said simply. "That's not something to hide or forget. He's part of your story, which makes him part of ours too. I thought he deserved a place in our home." She turned and wrapped her arms around him, overwhelmed by the generosity of this gesture. "How did I get so lucky to find you?" "I'm the lucky one," he murmured against her hair. "You let me in when you had every reason to keep the world out. That's the bravest thing I've ever seen anyone do." They stayed like that for a long moment, holding each other in their new home, before Isaac swept her into his arms again and carried her toward their bedroom, both of them laughing. The months that followed were some of the happiest of Olivia's life. She and Isaac ran the store together, and under their combined management, it flourished. They added new inventory, extended delivery routes, and even began supplying some of the mining camps in the mountains. Isaac's steady presence and Olivia's business sense proved to be an unbeatable combination. But more than the success of the store, it was the small, daily intimacies of marriage that filled Olivia with quiet joy. Waking up beside Isaac each morning, his face peaceful in sleep. Sharing coffee on the porch while they watched the sun rise over the mountains. The way he'd touch her hand in passing, a gentle reminder that he was there and she wasn't alone. The way they'd talk late into the night about everything and nothing, their conversations flowing as easy as breathing. Summer brought heat and dust storms, and with them, news from St. Louis. Thomas's father had died, and his mother had written to Olivia, a stiff, formal letter that nonetheless carried an undercurrent of grief. Olivia wrote back, extending her condolences and gently but firmly reiterating that she wouldn't be selling the store or returning to St. Louis. She told Thomas's mother about Isaac, about her new life, and ended with an invitation to visit Benton if she ever wished to see where her son had lived his final months. She never received a reply, but that was all right. Some bridges were meant to remain unbuilt. In September, Olivia began to suspect she might be pregnant. She waited another month to be sure before telling Isaac, nervous despite herself. They talked about children, but in an abstract, someday way. Now someday was becoming real, and she wasn't sure how he'd react. She told him one evening after they'd closed the store, the two of them sitting at their kitchen table with the lamp turned low. "I have something to tell you," she began, watching his face. "I'm fairly certain I'm going to have a baby." Isaac's expression went through several rapid changes: surprise, wonder, joy, fear, and then joy again, stronger than before. "Truly," she nodded. "The doctor confirmed it this morning. The baby should come in late April or early May." He reached across the table and took both her hands, his grip gentle but trembling slightly. "A baby, our baby." Then his face fell. "Are you happy about this? I know with Thomas gone and everything you went through, I don't want you to feel I'm happy," she interrupted, squeezing his hands. "I'm scared too, but I'm happy. This baby is ours, Isaac. A new beginning, not a replacement for anything lost." Relief and love flooded his features. He came around the table and pulled her into his arms, holding her close. "We're going to have a family," he whispered, wonder in his voice. "You've given me more than I ever dreamed possible." "We're giving it to each other," she corrected, and felt his smile against her hair. The pregnancy progressed well, though Olivia found the winter months challenging. Isaac was endlessly patient with her moods and cravings, and he insisted she rest more, taking on even more of the store's physical work. The town women rallied around her too, offering advice and hand-me-down baby clothes, welcoming her fully into the community in a way she hadn't quite experienced before. In late April, just as the cottonwoods were leafing out along the creek, Olivia went into labor. It was a long, difficult process that stretched through the night and into the next day. Isaac stayed beside her the entire time, holding her hand, wiping her forehead, murmuring encouragement even when she cursed him for getting her into this situation. Finally, as the sun reached its zenith on a beautiful spring day, their son entered the world with a lusty cry that proclaimed his displeasure at the change in circumstances. "A boy," the doctor announced, placing the squalling infant on Olivia's chest. "A healthy, strong boy." Olivia looked down at her son, at his tiny red face and waving fists, and felt her heart expand in ways she hadn't known possible. Isaac leaned over them both, his face wet with tears, and touched the baby's hand with one careful finger. "He's perfect," Isaac whispered. "Olivia, he's perfect." They named him Samuel Thomas Zimmerman, honoring both the future and the past. Samuel had been Isaac's father's name, and Thomas was for the man who'd been Olivia's first love. When Thomas's mother received the announcement, she sent a brief note of congratulations and a silver rattle that had belonged to Thomas as a baby. It was a small gesture, but it felt like a sort of peace. Samuel was a good baby, quick to smile and curious about everything. He had Isaac's dark hair and Olivia's gray eyes, and watching Isaac with their son never failed to make Olivia's heart swell. Isaac was a natural father, patient and playful, singing off-key lullabies and making ridiculous faces to earn Samuel's gummy smiles. They hired a young woman named Annie to help in the store, giving Olivia time to care for Samuel without abandoning the business entirely. Life developed a new rhythm, busier and more chaotic than before, but filled with a richness that made even the exhausting days worthwhile. On Samuel's first birthday, they held a party in their backyard, inviting what seemed like half of Benton. Children ran through the grass, adults talked and laughed, and Samuel sat in his father's lap, mesmerized by the cake with its single candle. "Make a wish for him," Olivia told Isaac, and watched as her husband closed his eyes for a moment before blowing out the candle with Samuel's help. "What did you wish for?" she asked later, after the guests had gone home and Samuel was asleep in his crib. Isaac pulled her close, his arms around her waist as they stood in their son's doorway, watching the gentle rise and fall of the baby's breathing. "I wished that he grows up knowing he's loved, that he's brave and kind and strong. And that someday, if he's as lucky as his father, he finds someone who makes him as happy as you make me." Olivia turned in his arms, looking up at the man who'd waited patiently for her heart to heal, who'd shown her that trust wasn't something to be feared but something to be cultivated with care. "I love you, Isaac Zimmerman, more than I ever thought possible." "I love you too," he said and kissed her softly. "Thank you for taking a chance on me, for being brave enough to trust again." "Thank you for being worth the risk," she replied. The years passed in the way that happy years do, both quickly and slowly. Samuel grew into a bright, energetic boy who loved helping in the store and exploring the mountains with his father. When he was 3, Olivia became pregnant again, and this time the birth was easier. They welcomed a daughter they named Margaret Ruth, called Maggie from the moment she drew breath. Maggie had her father's easy temperament and her mother's determined spirit. By the time she could walk, she was rearranging the store's shelves and bossing her older brother around with impressive authority. The store continued to prosper, becoming one of the most successful businesses in Benton. Isaac and Olivia eventually expanded, buying the building next door and breaking through the wall to create twice the space. They employed 3 people regularly now, and during busy seasons, even more. But success in business, while satisfying, wasn't what made Olivia's life feel complete. It was the small moments that mattered most. Family dinners around their table, with Samuel and Maggie arguing about everything and nothing. Sunday morning church services, followed by picnics by the creek. Isaac teaching Samuel to ride a horse while Maggie watched from her father's shoulders, demanding her turn. Quiet evenings after the children were asleep, when she and Isaac would sit on their porch, holding hands and watching the stars. When Samuel was 8 and Maggie was 5, Olivia found herself pregnant one more time. This pregnancy was harder than the others, and she was confined to bed for the last 2 months. Isaac took over running both the house and the store with remarkable competence, though he looked exhausted most days. Their second daughter, Anna Rose, arrived early but healthy in the autumn of 1886. She was smaller than the other 2 had been, more delicate, with pale blonde hair that came from neither parent but must have reached back to some distant ancestor. "She looks like a fairy tale princess," Maggie proclaimed, peering at her new sister with fascination. "She looks like trouble," Samuel said, but there was affection in his voice. Isaac just looked at Olivia with tired but happy eyes. "Our family's complete now," he said softly. 3 beautiful children and the woman I love. I couldn't ask for anything more." As Anna grew, she proved to be both princess and trouble, with a streak of mischief that kept everyone on their toes. But she was also sweet and sensitive, quick to cry over injured animals and always first to offer hugs when someone seemed sad. Watching their 3 children grow, Olivia sometimes thought about the young widow she'd been when Isaac first walked into her store. That frightened woman who'd been so certain her capacity for trust had died with her first husband. She wished she could go back and tell that woman that hope wasn't foolish, that hearts were more resilient than they seemed, and that sometimes the best things in life came from having the courage to try again. Years continued to pass, measured in birthdays and Christmases, in first days of school and skinned knees, in late-night conversations and early morning coffee, in the thousand small moments that made up a life well lived. Samuel grew into a serious young man who wanted to study law. Isaac and Olivia scraped together the money to send him to college in Helena, proud beyond measure when he returned with honors. Maggie became interested in medicine, apprenticing with Benton's doctor and eventually going east to study nursing. Anna, the baby, surprised everyone by developing a talent for music, her voice pure and clear enough to draw tears. Through it all, Isaac and Olivia remained each other's constant. They grew older together, their hair turning gray, lines deepening around their eyes. But the love between them only grew stronger, tempered by time and trial into something unshakable. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Isaac took Olivia back to the place where they'd first kissed as an engaged couple, on the porch of the general store under the stars. 20 years, he marveled, his arm around her waist. It feels like yesterday and like forever all at once. I know what you mean, Olivia said, leaning into him. Isaac, do you remember what you told me the night you proposed? That you couldn't promise nothing bad would ever happen, but you'd do everything in your power to come home to me every night. I remember. You've kept that promise. Every single night for 20 years, you've come home to me. You've loved me through good times and hard times. You've been patient when I was difficult, strong when I was weak, and gentle when I needed gentleness. You've given me a life more beautiful than any I could have imagined. Isaac turned her to face him, his hands cupping her face the way he had on their wedding day. You made it easy to keep that promise. Loving you has been the simplest, most natural thing I've ever done. Coming home to you isn't a duty, Olivia. It's a joy. They kissed under the familiar stars, two people who'd found their way to each other through patience and pain, who'd built a life together brick by brick, day by day. More years passed. Samuel married a lawyer's daughter from Helena and brought her home to meet the family. Maggie met a doctor during her studies and wrote home with news of her engagement. Anna received a scholarship to study music in San Francisco, her talent opening doors none of them had dreamed possible. As the children married and started their own families, Isaac and Olivia found themselves entering a new phase of life. The store, which they'd run for over 30 years, was sold to Annie, who'd worked for them since Samuel was a baby and knew the business as well as they did. Retirement felt strange at first, but also freeing. They traveled a bit, visiting their children in their new homes, meeting grandchildren who called them grandma and grandpa with voices full of love. They spent long afternoons on their porch, reading and talking and simply being together. They volunteered at the church, helped their neighbors, and lived the quiet, contented life they'd earned. One evening, when Isaac was 72 and Olivia was 70, they sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the mountains purple and gold. Samuel and his family were visiting, filling the house with noise and laughter. Through the open windows, they could hear their grandchildren playing, their children talking, the sounds of family and life and continuity. You ever regret it? Olivia asked suddenly. All those months you waited for me to be ready. You could have found someone else, someone who wasn't so damaged and afraid. Isaac looked at her, surprise and tenderness mixing in his expression. Not for a single second. You were never damaged, Olivia. You were wounded, and there's a difference. Wounds heal, given time and care, and you were worth waiting for. You've always been worth everything. She reached for his hand, their fingers intertwining with the ease of 50 years of practice. I was so afraid to trust again. But you showed me that trust isn't about knowing for certain that nothing bad will happen. It's about believing that whatever happens, you'll face it together. We did face it together, Isaac said. Every joy, every sorrow, every ordinary day in between, and I'd do it all again in a heartbeat. As the last light faded from the sky and the first stars emerged, Olivia thought about the journey that had brought them here. From a frightened widow behind a counter to a grandmother surrounded by love. From a drifter looking for purpose to a man with a legacy that would outlive him. They'd built something real and lasting, not just in the children and grandchildren who carried on their names, but in the love they'd nurtured and protected through all the years. "I love you, Isaac Zimmerman," she said, the words as true now as they'd been the first time she'd said them. "I love you, Olivia Zimmerman," he replied, "today, tomorrow, and all the days after." They sat together as darkness fell and the stars came out. Two people who'd found their way home to each other, who'd learned that the heart's capacity for love was greater than its capacity for fear, and that patience and trust could build something strong enough to last a lifetime. Inside, their family laughed and talked, carrying forward the love that Isaac and Olivia had planted all those years ago in a small Montana town called Benton. And outside, under the vast Montana sky, two people who'd once been broken but who'd healed together held hands and watched the stars, knowing that their story, which had begun with fear and patience, had bloomed into something beautiful beyond measure. The decades that followed brought both joy and natural sorrow. When Isaac passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 86, Olivia grieved deeply, but without the consuming fear she'd experienced with Thomas's death. She'd had 58 years with Isaac, years filled with more love than most people experienced in several lifetimes. She knew how lucky that made her. At Isaac's funeral, attended by children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, Olivia stood at the graveside and spoke about the man who'd waited patiently for her heart to be ready, who'd shown her that trust was a gift worth giving, and who'd loved her faithfully every day of their long life together. "He was my second chance," she told the gathered crowd, her voice steady despite her tears. "But more than that, he was my choice. Every day I chose him, and every day he chose me." That's what love really is, not just a feeling, but a decision you make over and over again to be there for each other. Isaac taught me that, and it's the most valuable lesson I ever learned. Olivia lived another 4 years after Isaac's passing, surrounded by her family and sustained by her memories. She spent her final days in the house Isaac had bought for them all those years ago, looking at the shelf he'd built that still held photographs Thomas in his youth, Isaac in his prime, and now dozens more of children and grandchildren and the rich, full life they'd all built together. On a quiet spring morning, with Maggie holding one hand and Anna holding the other, Olivia closed her eyes for the last time. Her final words were a whisper. "I'm coming home, Isaac. I'm ready." She was buried next to Isaac in the Benton Cemetery, under a headstone that read, "Olivia Zimmerman, beloved wife, mother, grandmother. She learned to trust again, and love made her brave." At her funeral, Samuel stood before the gathered crowd, a crowd that included not just family but half the town of Benton, people whose lives had been touched by Olivia and Isaac's quiet kindness over the years. "My mother used to tell us that she'd had 2 great loves in her life," Samuel said. "Thomas, who taught her what love could be, and my father, who taught her what love could become. She said both were gifts, both were important, and both made her who she was. She lived her life proving that the heart's capacity for love isn't limited, that trust can be rebuilt, and that patience and kindness can heal even the deepest wounds." He paused, looking out at the sea of faces. She and my father built something remarkable together. Not just a business or a family, though both were considerable achievements. They built a testament to what's possible when two people commit to choosing each other, day after day, year after year. They showed us that love isn't just passion and romance, though they had plenty of both. Love is also patience. It's trust. It's showing up. It's waiting for someone to be ready and then walking beside them for the rest of their lives. After the service, the family gathered at the house. Children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren filled every room, sharing stories and memories, keeping the legacy alive. They talked about how Grandma Olivia had taught them to be strong, how Grandpa Isaac had taught them to be kind, and how together they taught everyone that the best things in life were worth waiting for. Late that evening, Samuel stood on the porch where his parents had spent so many evenings together. He looked out at the mountains, still purple and gold in the fading light, and felt the weight of continuity and connection. His parents' love story had started here, in this rough Montana town, born from tragedy and fear and the patient insistence of a man who'd seen something worth waiting for. That love had grown and flourished, producing children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who would carry forward its lessons. Love without trust was hollow. Trust without patience was impossible, and patience without hope was pointless. Isaac and Olivia had understood all of that, had lived it and demonstrated it, and in doing so had created something that would outlast them both. Years later, Samuel's own granddaughter would ask him to tell her the story of how Grandma Olivia and Grandpa Isaac met. He would gather all the little ones around and tell them about the frightened young widow and the patient cowboy, about waiting and trust and the slow building of something strong. Did they live happily ever after? The granddaughter would ask, because children always ask that. And Samuel would smile and say, they lived. They loved. They built a life together that was worth living. And yes, sweetheart, they were happy. Not every single moment of every single day life doesn't work that way, but in the ways that mattered most, they had their happily ever after. The story of Olivia and Isaac became part of the family's mythology, passed down through generations. The store they'd run was still standing in Benton, a historical landmark now, with a plaque that told the story of the widow who'd built a business and the cowboy who'd waited patiently for her heart to heal. Tourists would sometimes visit Benton and ask about the couple mentioned on the plaque. Locals would smile and share whatever stories they knew, keeping the memory alive. Some said on quiet evenings, you could still feel something special about that old store, some lingering warmth that spoke of love and patience and second chances. The house where they'd raised their family eventually became home to Samuel's youngest son and his growing family, keeping it in the Zimmerman line. The shelf Isaac had built still stood in the parlor, now holding photographs spanning 5 generations. And in the cemetery on the hill above town, 2 headstones stood side by side, marking the resting place of 2 people who'd shown that the heart's capacity for healing was matched only by its capacity for love. Their story was complete. It had begun in fear and pain, in a general store in Montana where a widow met a cowboy looking for honest work. It had grown through patience and small kindnesses, through trust slowly rebuilt and love carefully nurtured. It had flourished into marriage and children, grandchildren and great-grandchildren, into a legacy that touched countless lives. And at its heart was a simple truth that Isaac and Olivia had lived every day of their long life together. That trust, once broken, could be rebuilt. That hearts, once wounded, could heal. That love, given time and patience and care, could transform everything. That sometimes the most powerful gift you could give someone was simply to wait to be there, steady and sure, until they were ready to try again. In the end, that was their happily ever after. Not a fairy tale of effortless perfection, but a real story of real people who chose each other, who worked at their love every day, who built something strong enough to weather whatever storms came their way. They'd shown that second chances were possible, that trust could be rewarded, and that the patient ones, the ones willing to wait until the heart was ready, were often the ones most worthy of that trust. Their love had started in a small Montana town in the late 1870s, and its effects rippled forward through time, touching lives they would never meet, inspiring stories they would never hear. But somewhere in the accumulated weight of all those moments, all those choices, all those days of choosing each other, Isaac and Olivia had created something eternal. They had loved, they had trusted, they had waited. And in doing so, they had proven that the best love stories aren't about perfect people finding each other at the perfect time. They're about wounded people finding the courage to try again, about patient people giving others the space to heal, and about two souls recognizing in each other something worth fighting for. That was the legacy of Olivia and Isaac Zimmerman. And in the hearts of all who knew their story, they would live forever, two people who turned pain into patience, fear into trust, and loneliness into love, showing the world that happily ever after was possible for anyone brave enough to believe in second chances. Their story was complete. And it was beautiful.